Hello, everyone. And I just don't want to go home. I know
Same.
it's getting late, but I don't want to go home. This is JKL Media, where three friends
Fun.
talk about a wide range of topics. We take turns picking which, and to no one's surprise, my pick is E Street Band related. We are talking Little Steven's new documentary just came out, and it's Disciple. As always, on our discussions, we have Karen
Hello.
and Lou.
Good morning, everyone, or whatever time of day you're listening to this.
So, as I said, we take turns picking, and I was waffling on what series or movie we wanted to talk about. And when I figured out this was going to come out in time for us to discuss it, I picked it. My wonderful co-host, as always, are like, hey, it's your turn. Let's pick. If you listen to our Babylon 5 episode, Lou has already mentioned a couple things about the documentary, but let's get with Karen. Quick thoughts.
Like Lou said, it is very much a time capsule where when he talks about the seasons of his life, and this has four parts to it that kind of go through each time period of his life. I got huge memories of mine flashing back. Where was I when this happened and things like that. And it really made me feel all warm and mushy inside when it came to that. And I feel like he is such an interesting person. And I very much enjoyed the documentary, even if I don't like the person, and I like him. Even if I don't like the person, I tend to like biography because they always are interesting. They give me facts that I never knew and something about the time period. But in this case, I think he is an exemplary human being. To see some of the things that happened in the background of his life was.
And Lou?
When I first sat down to watch this and fired it up and it said 2 hours and 25 minutes, my jaw dropped. I thought, 2 hours and 25 minutes? What could possibly be in this documentary that warrants such a long runtime? And because everybody that's familiar with Bruce Springsteen's Little Steve is a name that you know, but he's not a primary player in my pop culture world. Like I know who he is and I know that he plays with the band, but that was about it. I had forgotten that he was instrumental in the Sun City South African things, but when I started it, I thought, man, there must be a lot of concert footage in here because how the hell is this going to run for 2.5 hours? But once I got into it and then found out exactly who he was and what he had done, I was blown away. And like I said in our other podcast, this is such a time capsule of seeing a range of people from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that I had not seen in a while. A lot of really great footage from all the time periods as well. So it's not too much talking heads. It's mostly footage from the eras, and I was just totally engrossed in it. And I was just amazed at how much he has done in his life. And I was also shocked that, and I shouldn't be because I've seen Bruce and Bruce is obviously getting older, but I didn't realize like the guy was 73 years old. So yeah, this was a quite an eye opener of a documentary for me, for sure. And I
It
think
looks
it'll probably,
great.
yeah, and I think it probably will be for a lot of other people that are just casual Springsteen fans.
Yeah, I had read Steven's book, and when he was promoting it, obviously everyone wants to talk about him leaving the E Street Band. And he talked about multiple times that he now tells bands don't break up. Don't just go do your solo projects, have fun, do everything, but you don't need to officially break up because you can always come back together. And there was a discussion that when Bruce was being inducted into the Hall of Fame, Steven pushed him not to accept it, that he said this should be the band going. And Bruce said there was a little bit of ego, a little bit of not. And so he accepted it anyway. But then later, when the E Street Band was nominated and inducted, he realized that it is Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. Sly and the Family Stones. He said there is 1 + 1 = 3. You are greater than the sum of your parts. So the documentary was a lot of things that he covers in the book, but seeing it visually versus in the written word was really fun to see. It is a long documentary, and I know that certain critics will talk about do you really need that much time? But I think this was paced well.
Hmm.
And the reality is this guy has had a fascinating life.
Yep.
I think I got my notes right, but the first book one, Salvation. So they're talking about his roots, his work with Southside Johnny, which a lot of people are not aware of because
Hmm.
Southside Johnny did not become a national star the way that Bruce did. But and his work with the E Street Band and Bruce being friends, meeting each other when they were high schools. In Bruce's latest, his album that came out in 2020, Letter to You, and he talks about rock and roll is the only business where you can still be friends and work with your high school buddies. So, Karen, we're going to just talk about, let's say, and this is a big segment, but from where they met till little Steven decides, I've got to go solo, and he leaves the E Street Band. A lot of
Sure.
room to play with. Let's talk about that.
Lot of stuff. I'm probably going to concentrate on his life before the E Street Band, and then I'll talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
But it was so cool to see footage from back then when he was, what was it, Miami Steve?
Yes.
That was fun. I always think of him as very flamboyant, and to see him flamboyant but also muted from what he is today,
Yeah.
that was really cool. And I feel like everyone goes through that phase in high school where like you want to brand yourself, you want to make your own identity. And I feel like that was his time to do that. And so he decided he was going to be Miami Steve. He talks about how he liked nicknames and monikers that kind of give away to people who you are. And I feel like that really embodied him at that time. And when he came back to New Jersey and everyone's, what is this Miami Steve thing? And he put his foot down. Yes, I'm going to stay Miami Steve because that's who I am. I thought that was great. Just as a little side note for that. I know it's not a little side note right now. I thought that was really cool. And to actually see interviews with some of the guys that he played with back then, there was a couple guys from Southside Johnny and the Jukes or whatever. I might be mixing those two bands up. Sorry.
No,
But
you're good.
am I right? Okay. To see some of those people actually come on and explain, yeah, this is who he was. We knew who he was. He was instrumental in our careers, and he had an innate ability to just be in music, write music, arrange music, figure out what was going to play, knowing the mood that a band was trying to set. And it just really brought another dimension to his character. I'll say this. I watched The Sopranos. I loved that show. And when I saw him on there, I thought that cannot be little Stevie. He just didn't look like little Stevie. And as he says, he put on some weight to do that role. And it was interesting to see his evolution as he went through these phases of his life. And we get to see him like in the show Lillehammer, in his personal life, in his life in the E Street Band, in his life as a young person. I love to see him and Bruce when they first met and how young they were, and him just being that beginning stage of finding out who he was because music had just become this big part. He talks about how when the Beatles came over, that was the impetus for people who were into music to say, you know what, it's not uncool anymore to have a band and to play music. And that, I feel like that changed, that was a formidable part of his life that changed him into the person he was always. And I thought that was really awesome to see that part. And the whole documentary was interesting through the whole thing, but to see the background of how he evolved into the consummate musician that he became, I feel like that was so informative to me that I knew who he was, definitely. He was all over the place as I grew up. I saw him in different stages, but I'm not old enough to have known him from anything other than the E Street Band and the Sopranos. So that was really cool to see the start of his career and all that. And then being in the E Street Band, I think it was a huge benefit to Bruce, because they do mention that in their life they touched several times. They separated and then they touched, but they were always friends and brothers from another mother, as it were. And when he got into the E Street Band, Bruce was like, "Yeah, I'd like to have you in the band. So let's just start a backing group, and you'll be in there, and Clarence will be in there, and we'll have a cohesive group." And Stevie being the person that he could count on as a sounding board. We saw that also when they mentioned how Bruce's promoters and his record label wanted to put him in a different lane. And Stevie said, "No, do it this way. Do it from your heart. Throw away the sheet music." And I think that also changed Bruce's life a little bit, that he went from being a corporate shill into a storyteller. And I think little Stevie is such an important part of his life. And to see how that evolved into that solid relationship, even when he left, I think that really informs his character.
Lou,
Did I cover everything?
you did. You did
Okay.
great. Lou?
Yeah, there's nothing left for me to say. No,
Stop it.
I think the thing that really jumped out at me, and I mentioned this in our other show that we just did, that this was an amazing time capsule. And to me, this is very much showing a different era of how people grew up. If the Beatles' climb to fame has been documented so many times that we're all aware of the Liverpool, the British invasion scene. Seattle had the grunge thing going on, and we all knew about the Jersey Shore music scene, but it had never really been, at least not to my knowledge, documented before, especially in such an in-depth manner. And to see this environment being captured in this documentary, seeing Stevie Van Zandt as so young and hungry, and Bruce the same, like all these people in that time period, they weren't famous at that point, so it just makes them all seem more like real people instead of the pop media culture figures that we've come to know them now. And what really struck me is how important Stephen was to Bruce Springsteen. I knew that he was part of the band. I knew that he wrote some of the songs or worked on some of the songs, but I didn't realize how independent Bruce was on Steve. And I think Bruce owes a lot of his success to Steve, more than I imagined before I sat down to watch this documentary. And Steve Van Zandt is a very interesting character, and just staying within this first book, he's young and in general, like the Jersey Shore, I think being not an American, but a Canadian, Canadians are always so polite but in the Jersey Shore, everybody's much more in everybody's face, so they're much more aggressive about things. And whether it was instinctual for him or something that he just wanted to groom, the way that he dressed, the bandanas, all the extra jewelry, necklaces, the rings, earrings, all that stuff. His hair was long back then, and Bruce, it was weird seeing Bruce with such long hair. I don't think I'd seen him with that kind of long hair before.
It is a little weird, isn't it?
Yeah. He was cultivating this persona, whether intentionally or not, but I was really amazed, especially from the other people that talked around him. And this is a documentary, and everybody's that involved is going to be saying nice things about him. This is a love letter to Stevie Van Zandt for sure, but I generally believed everything they were saying about how talented he was, not just on the stage, but in the production studio and whatnot. His ability to arrange music, and he cultivated like the bringing in horns and brass and all that kind of stuff into the band. It was just a real eye-opener. I didn't know much about him, and I'm going to keep saying that, but he's a very complicated guy. He's a real Renaissance man, is what I would say, and that comes out more in the later books. But it was just interesting to see he just migrated to this area of the country where this music scene was happening, and it was an exciting time. It reminds me, or it drives home the point of how organic the whole music business was at one time, and how that has been lost in today's world where everything is much more corporate, or people are just sitting in their rooms making music on the computers, and instead of getting out there and mixing and mingling with other artists. And I love his sense of respect for the music, and his willingness to, or his drive to preserve the history of the music as well, which I think is which also is very important. I think that's been lost as well today. And yeah, it was just it just brought me back to a time in my life when, just as a listener of music, things were so different then. It was because you were limited
Yeah.
in your ability to listen to music. You had either records or the radio, and then later cassette
Yeah.
tapes and blah, blah, blah. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was a very different era, and I think that first book really captured that well. And I was just, once that first book was established, who he was, I was like totally hooked into saying, "Holy cow, this guy was really important." So,
Yeah.
real eye opener.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I have a similar feeling there. One of my favorite podcasts is A History of Rock and Roll in 500 Songs
Okay.
by Andrew Hickey, and he just did a two-part on Sly Stone.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, okay, wow. Well, how does that warrant two episodes? And I did not realize, and it's fascinating to hear how much he was involved in the San Francisco soul music scene, and how Sly and the Family Stone were actually a very brief career, but an incredibly influential career. Yeah, a couple of things. One, I love the story that, and I'm going to get the dates wrong, right? February 8th, there were no bands in America. The Beatles are on. Ed Sullivan, February 9th, and then February 10th, every garage had a band.
Yep.
But it wasn't until you saw the Rolling Stones you realized, oh, we can do this because
Mhm.
And
yeah,
I don't have to be clean cut and the
yeah,
Beatles. I can be my own person.
yeah.
Yeah.
I also think that it was interesting that one of my favorite statements written by Aaron Sorkin, and Jeremy, the character in Sports Night, is talking to the boss. And why am I drawing a
Robert
blank?
Guillaume.
Yeah, Robert Guillaume's character. And Robert Guillaume character says, if you're dumb, you surround yourself with smart people. If you're smart, you surround yourself with smart people who disagree with you.
Yep.
Mhm.
And I love Bruce's idea. I wanted little Steven on one side, John Landau on the other, and this made me a better musician. But toward the end, little Steven didn't feel like his voice was being heard as much, and so he decided to go off solo. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I love the idea. They're effing up my friend's record.
Yep.
And then
Yep.
Steve and Bruce goes, then go fix it.
And he
And he's
did.
Yeah, and he's like, the 10th Avenue freeze out, the horns were totally designed by Steven.
Right.
He is the one who told him how to do that. And the idea that he had done this, he felt comfortable being the side guy, right? I don't
Yeah.
want to be the guy. I want to be the guy counts on.
Or the background guy, even.
Yeah, and exactly. And just having that back and forth. I love the idea that in Born to Run, in Darkness, you killed me. Like, we
Mm.
can't do this again. And so the work on it. And then little Steven talks about this a lot in interviews. He said, we busted our ass. We're gonna get the paycheck, and I decide to quit.
I think he felt like that. Looking back on it, probably a bad decision, but it also led to other things. So,
And we're going to go to the next chapter. But yes, he said, if I had stayed, obviously apartheid would have ended sooner or later. Would it have ended the same? And he's not being egotistical. He feels, and I think a lot of people say, that I had never thought of apartheid. I had never thought about that. And I remember that Sun City video. I
Yep.
remember the
Yep.
discussion, and that made me think of that the first time.
Yep.
And so we'll go to, yeah, the second book two is Revolution. So
Can
Little Stephen,
can I
yes, please.
propose something real
Yeah,
quick? I hate to interrupt you, but
yeah,
I don't know if it's on your list. Maybe you have it
yeah.
down for later, but I want to talk about all the people that were
Oh, sure,
documentary.
please.
Do you have that listed as something
What
we're
I
going to
was
talk
going to
about?
bring up is that I think the surprising star is Eddie Vedder is funny as
Right?
F on this thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Like when he's talking about little Steven leaving the band and Niels Lofgren, he says he's your stepdad who's blanking your mother,
Yep,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
please,
I
Karen,
love
if you
seeing
want.
him.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please. I think this is great.
I loved seeing him. I mean, there was a lot of surprising people in it. I was surprised to see John, not John Lennon, the
Paul
one who's
McCartney.
alive, Paul
Paul
McCartney.
McCartney.
Yeah, the one that's not dead. Paul McCartney in it. He popped up and I'm like, what is he gonna have to say? And the fact that they actually collaborated on some stuff was a shock to me. So seeing him here there was cool. Gary U.S. Bonds, he had a few hits out when I was in high school that I loved. So seeing him was great.
And
Uh,
those were directly from Bruce and Little Steve.
exactly. And again, that's something I didn't know. Ruben Blades being in it, he's someone that I love as well. Seeing David Chase, not a surprise, but
Yeah.
very cool. Let me see who
And
else.
Chris Columbus.
Chris Columbus. I
Yeah.
was just going to mention that. One of my favorite pop-ins, though, was Darlene Love, and
Yes.
she came up quite a bit. And I know we have the Christmas songs that she has done. She is one of my favorite Christmas song singer. And so to see her talk about little Stevie, I think that was a different level of her that I got
Yeah.
to see. Also, Southside Johnny, which was
Yeah.
interesting because that gave us a lot more information. Vincent Pastore
Yeah.
from The Sopranos as well. I'm going down the list here.
Yeah.
Cheetah Rivera, again, out of left field, but cool to see her in there. Richie Sambora, not a surprise.
Yeah.
Of course, Bruce. Mike Stoller from Stoller and Lieber. That's Mike Stoller, right? Wow, that was crazy. And being a fan of the Monkees, here's something that you guys might not know about me. I was a huge fan of the Monkees growing up, and they wrote quite a few songs for the
Right.
Monkees. That was cool to see him in a different way. Like you said, Eddie Vedder, Bill Wyman, just
Yeah.
so many things showing up. And I think that was a huge part of this documentary, seeing him from each of those people's lives. And I know you brought up, Lou, you brought up grunge and all the
Hmm.
things that go with it. I'm a little bit younger than you, and grunge was my thing,
Hmm.
especially since I crossed paths with,
Kurt Cobain?
no, the other one.
Go. Yeah.
Yeah, David Grohl,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, we overlapped in high school for a year. So uh that was something that was like, oh God, I know that guy. Now I got to
Yeah.
get into it. And once I did, I loved it. Eddie Vedder,
Yeah.
Kurt Cobain, and all that, just it was my jam in high school. I was not into the Madonna side of things in high school. That was
Yeah.
my thing. And I think there's a lot of documentaries about that.
Sure.
And there's very few documentaries about this part of rock and roll, the origins of that gritty sound. And I think if we hadn't had these people, the people from Jersey, the people from New
Yeah.
York, that grittiness, we wouldn't have had grunge.
Yeah.
100%. So I thought seeing all those people talk about him was just, I think, the highlight of the documentary for me.
If you like Darlene Love, he did Introducing Darlene Love a few years ago where he produced. Bruce wrote a couple of songs. It's a really good release. Yeah, one of the things that he decides he's going to be a solo artist, and he talks about how he became political and how he didn't expect to be political. And he talks about, why are you putting missiles in my country? And
Hmm.
he's, what? I don't put any missiles. I'm a musician.
Right.
And this idea that he became very political, I thought by the way, Maureen Van Zant has been nice enough to be on my podcast twice.
Wow.
Awesome.
And she was just a lovely person. And I thought her story of I married Miami Steve, then became Little Steven, and then all of a sudden he became this political guy that I honestly was worried about his life.
Hmm.
And I think he is slightly being hyperbolic, hyper, being
Hyperbole.
hyperbolic when he says it's okay to fight for civil rights, but when you bring down a government, people don't want that anymore. I think
Right.
that's slightly an exaggeration, but I do think there is a grain of truth to fighting apartheid and little Stephen going to the senators and saying, I will help you fight this Reagan veto.
Yep.
And you think, why would anyone care what a rock and roll guitarist would care? But he did do that. So I'm going to keep with you, Karen. The political side of this and how active he became. What are your thoughts on that? And I can remember that I'm not going to play Sun City video, and I can remember all the interviews he did. So thoughts on that, Karen, and then I'll get to with you, Lou.
Okay.
Yeah, the Sun City stuff was a big part also of that time in my life where I wanted to be that kind of person, someone who fought against oppression and things like that. There was a lot of stuff going on in that time period. We had Live Aid and Farm Aid and all that sort of thing around that time too in the 80s. And they didn't really play a lot of that song, but I can hear it. I won't play Sun City. I remember that song and all the iterations of it. And to see how incredibly he was involved in that was something that passed over me. And I can see, honestly, him saying my life was in danger because I think his life was in danger. And I think he inserted himself in things that he needed to in order to get the job done, but also they were dangerous. And it might be a little hyperbolic, but I do think that it's a truth. And Maureen had every right to be worried. So yeah, very cool activism, and to see him, Bono and Peter Gabriel also were a big part of that, and to see them talk about it as well was great.
Lou?
Yeah, this is where my interest really turned and increased because I don't know if it was conveyed directly or not in this section of the documentary, but I don't know if it was a conscious decision on his part to become more political after meeting that German teenager talking about the missiles. But when he made that decision, I would have liked if the documentary would have dealt into that a little more as whether he realized that he would be taking a financial hit because he had to know that getting political like that in his music would limit his marketability to play on the mainstream radio and whatnot. So that was the part I was missing that I think the documentary missed. And I understand that there's only so much you can cover, and they were dealing more with the positives than the negatives. But because this was at the point of the documentary, I go, this guy is not just your typical rock and roller musician. He's got a lot of depth to him. He's got a very strong social conscience, I guess you could say. And whether intentionally or not, I think he made the people around him look more shallow because none of them would step in 2 feet first like he did and make such a commitment to following all these political things that he pursued. I thought it was telling that Bruce kept on saying it. Says none of his songs are political. Now they're all political. And I'm going, yeah. And you didn't really want to follow him in that path because you probably didn't want to hurt your marketability. Whether that's intentional or not, that was just the reaction I was getting from this segment of the documentary. But what also struck me was how not just how talented he was from an artistic point of view, like from the songs that he wrote, Sun City, but his ability to pull other people into his orbit to accomplish his goals. Like he had a who's who of rock, not just from the popular era, but from the previous eras, like from the music that he loved. All these, like he said, all these bands that the guys were in their 30s and they were already being put out to pasture because all this new other music was coming in and replacing them. But he respected those people and he availed himself of their talent to add to this song that he did. And he went across, like he had rappers, he had country and western stars. Like he just wasn't limited to one spectrum of the music. He respects all music, and that's why I say he's a real Renaissance man. I My respect for the guy really jumped during this segment, even though again I feel like there's rose-colored glasses of treatment of him, but you can't deny that the results of what he accomplished. And I was just really amazed at how many people he was able to pull into his orbit. I think it speaks volumes to his abilities. And again, this was another great time capsule of that period. This was like the 80s. And so it was, yeah, a real eye opener for me. I was really, I think about all the segments, this was the one that blew me away the most because it's a little like a mini Bob Geldof parallel. All right. So Bob Geldof hadn't planned to get into the Live Aid stuff, but it just organically grew from that. And um, I guess the other part I missed here and is this is the era where he split just before Born in the USA, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
they touched upon it a little bit about his leaving. And I would have liked to known a little bit more about it because Bruce hinted at it was a tough time, but he never really got into the details. And I don't know. Jesse, you probably know. Like, how much input did Stevie have into that album? Did he write any of the songs, or?
No, so Bruce always writes all the songs himself,
Hmm.
but Little Steven helped arrange them.
Okay.
So he was involved. He did tell the story that Little Steven was not a fan of Dancing in the Dark, but he said No Surrender had to stay on the
Right.
album.
Yep.
And then Bobby Jean is a very well-known secret that's really about Little Steven and Bruce.
Yeah. Yeah.
That and No Surrender is about him and Steven. I guess because I've read the book, and I know we just talked about that. If we hate when someone says, "Oh, you should have read the book," the
Yeah.
because I've read the book, there's enough statements in here that I do not feel like they are sugarcoating. He talked about right before the paycheck comes, he quits. And he talks about when he got The Sopranos, he was broke. So he has been very clear that he made every decision he made was the wrong decision financially.
Right.
That he at this point should be incredibly wealthy and not having to worry. And I don't know. I'm not saying he's at the poorhouse, but I do think he talked about that when he got that publishing deal from the guy who was the
Son. Yeah.
Alan
Alan Freed. Yeah.
Alan Freed's son at
Yeah.
Camp. So yeah, he was dropped by record companies. He has said, we'll get into well, we'll go ahead and jump around out. They talk about that Underground Railroad. I'm sorry, Underground Garage, Outlaw Country were both he started this radio show, and there are now channels on E Street Radio that he have been successful, but he puts the money back into it.
Right.
He talked about when he started touring the Disciples of Souls again, that he loses money on the tours because he's got 15 people on stage.
Yeah.
He's got horns and dancers and everything. In fact, when Linda and I went and saw him when he was here in Dallas, Linda knew none of the songs. And she says, I'm just having fun watching the four background singers dance.
Yeah.
She goes,
Yeah.
I'm just doing that. And so he also says, and there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek bitterness. He's
Mhm.
like, the E Street Band, we get 50,000 people to come see us. When I tour with the Disciple of Soul, I can't get 10%. You would think I could get 10%. I could get 5,000 people coming, but
Mhm.
I can't. And so financially, he has said he made every wrong decision.
Yeah. And
That, yeah.
I got the impression, incorrectly or not, like when he said he was broke, but I thought to myself, But you look like the kind of guy that is used to living a certain lifestyle, right?
Yes.
Certain
Yeah.
standard of living.
Sure.
And I don't know if that played a part in the fact that he was running out of money. And I was also curious because I don't know what his cut would have been if any of the Bruce albums that he did arrangements on, but you would think there would be enough royalties there to sustain him as well. But I don't know because
I
Yeah.
think
Bruce's earlier albums by then were selling quite well. So
when he says he was broke, I feel like he was probably comfortable,
maybe,
but not
yeah,
living the high
Yeah.
life.
yeah,
And
or
then,
maybe he just said in looking at himself in relation to Bruce, he was broke.
yeah.
Right.
And
That statement where he says, I was just staying at home walking my dog.
Yeah,
I think that's so cool. And to see him carrying around his dog and all
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Great.
yeah.
Yeah. And it is, I know that the Southside Johnny never became huge. He helped do the Gary U.S. Bonds. So I don't know if, and I do think that he made a choice that to be more political.
Yep.
I know when he decided to put out his album, Disciples of Soul, he talked about it was his greatest hits that he never sang.
Right.
Like these are a lot of songs he had written for other people. And I Don't Want to Go Home and It's Getting Late are two of my favorite songs. I love both of those songs. And we jumping ahead a little bit. I think Chris Columbus talking about I need a Christmas song,
Hmm.
and he writes one, and Darlene Love says you should ask Little Steven. Little Steven says, why don't I just get the E Street Band to come in here? And Chris
Right.
Columbus says, this is the greatest night of my life.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
because I was saying, why is this guy on there? Jonathan Demme, I can see because he directed
yeah,
the Sun City videos, but I
yeah,
didn't know the Chris Columbus connection until he finally made
yeah,
that connection to that
mhm,
movie, and I was going, oh, okay.
yeah. Yeah, so basically he's going through this whole revolution. He's doing this, and he basically burns all the bridges. And it's one thing you can be as political as you want if you're selling a lot of records, but if you're not selling records, it's going to happen.
Hey,
So
I
go
don't
ahead.
think he was burning his bridges. I think he was heating up his bridges
Yeah,
because everyone always thought fondly of him. I don't
yeah,
think he made anyone mad, but he definitely turned his back on a popular
yeah.
route.
And the executives, though, in record companies,
Oh,
maybe,
that's
right?
different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those
So,
people aren't worth it anyway, right?
yeah. So I think it's interesting. They cut to, and I had read this story many times where he's talking about the Rascals and
Hmm.
he's inducting them in Hall of Fame, and he looks like Silvio. He sounds like Silvio. And they did not go into this as much, and I'm hoping because there is a documentary coming out with David Chase, the unofficial, the behind the scenes on The Sopranos.
Oh, that's awesome.
He said, David Chase, like, he's going to be my Tony Soprano. And rightly, they said, yeah, HBO's not going to let you cast this guy who's never acted. And Lil Steven talked about, look, I'm not an actor and I cannot take a part from someone. My wife's an actress. I see how much work this is. It is not right for me to take a part. And David Chase says, then I'll just write you a part. This is written specifically for you. And the idea, and he talks about that, you're the only person that can stand up to the boss.
Yep.
That's the gig. Whether it's
And it's his
Bruce,
real life too, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
whether it's
Yeah.
Bruce or Tony Soprano. And he makes the joke, of course, in The Sopranos, you could die. Where and I think what if Elvis had a little Steven,
Yeah.
Right.
right?
Yeah. Exactly.
What if Janis Joplin had a little
Hmm.
Steven,
Yeah.
Jim Morrison,
Yeah.
an Amy Winehouse, whoever
Yeah.
that would be there? And even though little Steven's gone, he stayed in Bruce's orbit. They've remained friends. They talk about Little Richard marrying him and Maureen with Percy Faith
And that's
is
another
singing.
thing that maybe I'm old-fashioned, but the fact that he's been married to the same woman his whole life,
Yeah,
again, I think speaks to his character.
It
definitely.
does. It is amazing
Yeah,
that
especially in
they,
that business.
yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's changed so
Hmm.
much over the years and
yeah,
to see her evolve with him, I think that
Hmm.
was awesome to see.
Yeah. But I found, because I've never watched The Sopranos, because I'm just not a fan of gangster stuff. But the thing that I found so funny was the wigs or the hair on a
Yeah,
couple of the characters. It was reminding me of Londo from Babylon 5. So
Yep.
yeah,
his little Stevie's hair was like that pompadour was like something else.
yeah,
And then that other guy, I don't know the character's name, but the guy with the two white sideburn things and his hair was
yeah.
Yep.
all pulled back.
Paul,
I was just laughing
Polly
my head off at those
Walnuts.
yeah,
hairdos.
His name
yeah,
is Polly Walnuts, by the way.
yeah.
Yeah.
He is amazing in The Sopranos, and the
I felt Stevie was channeling Joe Pesci, but I don't
A
know
little
yeah,
because
bit.
I've never seen the show. So
yeah.
yeah.
I
Definitely
think
different from Joe Pesci, but
yeah,
he's great.
and there is that scene. There is definitely the dynamics of Bruce and him, and Tony and Silvio. That there is this. You have to be careful, but he does have to tell him the speak truth to power.
Mhm.
And then I have watched a little bit of Lilyhammer. I haven't watched all of them, but I think that was interesting. And that technically was the first original show on Netflix. I know House of Cards gets a lot of, but Lilyhammer was one of the first original dramas. He does that. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about, and then we can just jump around, he talks about the history of rock and roll, but he also talks about teaching. And
Hmm.
he talks about how we hurt ourselves with art. And he was on 60 Minutes when he was promoting his book. And he said, what you do is you go, who is your favorite artist? Beyonce. Oh, Beyonce was greatly influenced by Aretha Franklin. Oh, she was. And do you know Aretha Franklin was very influenced by the civil rights movement?
Mm.
And
Yep.
oh, do you know what the civil rights movement is? He said, and
No.
by getting the art and hook them to teach them
Yep.
history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
And so for the longest time, and I don't know if they still do it, but for the summer of his Disciple of Souls, if you were a teacher and you went to his website, you got a free ticket to any of his shows.
Mm.
If you
Wow.
proved you were a teacher, you got a free ticket to go to the show. I do not know if they're doing it now, but when the American tour, there was a meet and greet VIP tour that all the money went to Teachers Rock, and you got a free of a either a seat or a spot in the pit, your choice, and a meet and greet beforehand, and all the money went for Teachers Rock. He is incredibly dedicated to getting art back into schools.
Hmm.
He thinks that it is incredibly important. And as someone who lives in Texas, where we will spend millions on a football stadium and we can't find thousands for art supplies or music, it just seems to be the wrong thing.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah. And he is, I want to say the jack of all trades, master of none, but he actually is the master of,
Many.
Yeah.
he is good at what he does. And he says that there's always ideas in his mind about what he could do, what he
Right.
wants to do next.
You could almost see when he talked, you could almost see the churning in his
Yeah. The
mind
wheels
of,
turning. Yep.
yeah, looking back and thinking, what can I do now? How can I expand on all this? And even if it's not said, you can see the intelligence and the savvy of his brain and how it works. And I loved that, just seeing him. And he's selfless. He's not in it for himself. He was in it for Southside Johnny. He was in it for Bruce. He was in everything he did was for the benefit of someone else or something else. And I think
Hmm.
that's very commendable. Even his
Absolutely.
acting career was, I don't want to be the star. I want to be either background character or secondary character. It's not my gig.
Hmm.
And I think that was the right choice. I think Gandolfini was amazing in The Sopranos, and I don't doubt that he would have been good, but I don't know that it would have been the machine that it was if he was the star of it. His character was amazing. I love that he owned the strip club, right? Wasn't that his thing?
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have to say, Lou, it's not about the mob to be honest.
I know I've heard
It's
that before, but I
yeah, it's a
just,
character study,
yeah, I
really.
understand that. I just don't
Um,
like the setting.
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of mafia in it,
Yeah,
definitely, but it is
little Steve, I think right off the bat says that he's a very into the mafia. So it was
right.
Yeah.
interesting that
Oh
later
yeah,
on got cast in a
he
mafia show.
became
Yeah,
a mafia
yeah,
Mhm.
consigliere, yeah,
yeah.
Yeah.
even if it's fake. But I loved seeing him talk, the wheels churning, the amount of things that he did that he never got credit for that I didn't even know he was a part of.
Exactly.
He even after the Sun City, rainforest, South America, teachers, the policeman's ball, he's
Indian
been
rights.
behind. Right, Indian rights. I forgot about that. Getting people out of prison that don't deserve to be there. He did so many things, and I don't think of him as that until I watched the documentary. And now all of a sudden I'm seeing he's an onion. He
Yes.
has all these layers and he peeled them back in this documentary. And before it was an onion, it was the
Yeah.
skin was still on it. And I just loved seeing all that. I am so glad you picked this.
Yeah,
Even
same
we're
here.
not gonna finish talking about it now if you don't want to, but I
No.
just to put a cherry on top of what I'm saying here, this was this came out of left field for me. I knew I would enjoy it,
Yeah.
but to be so absorbed and to learn so much about so many things was a great surprise, a wonderful surprise.
Yeah. How about you, Lou?
Yeah,
Summing it up and yeah.
he's a very interesting guy because he's got this, because if you only see pictures of him in that, he just fits like the stereotypical rock and roller David Lee Roth kind
Sure.
of image.
Yeah.
But then when you see his documentary, I mentioned the fact that he's married to the same woman his whole life. That film that he did played off of his family life. He talked about his brother and sister. So he's got these very core traditional set of values that I think gave him the bedrock of why he was so successful and everything else. But it is ironic that he's obviously a very passionate musician, but it's all the other things that he did, I think, gave him the notoriety or claim that the accolades that he's receiving from all these interviews in the documentary, that his actual musical career is probably the least of it. He's obviously successful, but by the measures of everything else he's done, I think it's one of his lesser accomplishments, which is still no small thing, but it's just interesting that that's just the way his life turned out because of certain choices that he made. The other thing I really appreciated was the symmetry of the how the movie opened and it's ended, where they opened about him talking about the Beatles, and then at the end, and again, I was wondering, well, why are they showing clips of Paul McCartney? And then at the end,
Mhm.
you see him playing in the cavern with Paul McCartney. Like, what a way to bookend a life. That was a blast. I loved it. And out of all the accolades that he got, the fact that Paul McCartney says he knows more about music than I do, and I know a lot. Like I thought, wow, that little Steve. I'm surprised. I would have wished little Steve would have been on the screen when they had when Paul McCartney had said that, because that must have been like to get that kind of compliment from a legend like Paul McCartney. If I was little Steve, probably would have broke down and cried. Because I thought that was an amazing moment that really needed to have Steve on the screen to see his reaction, or I would have loved him to talk about it and he didn't. But yeah, I got to thank you for suggesting that we watch this. I'm always a little, and we all have our little pet things. Like you like Bruce, I
Yeah.
like Steve. So you always have this little kind of nagging, pushing this stuff on the other two guys, and they're just going along with it because we're friends and
Yeah.
we accommodate each other's interests in that. But this truly surprised me, and I'm really glad that I watched it. So thank you.
I have
Yeah.
to say, at the
Go ahead.
beginning of JKL Media, I felt like that, but I trust you guys so much
Yeah.
that when you recommend something, I think I'm going to get something out of it. And
Yeah.
in this case, it was much more than I thought I would.
Yeah. They did not talk about that, why he wears the scarf.
Is he
The book,
bald? I don't know.
no, he was involved in a car accident as a teenager,
Okay.
and his head smashed through the windshield, so he
Mm.
has scars on his head.
Okay.
And so that's when he started wearing hats and bandanas to cover that up.
Wouldn't his hair
And then
cover that up?
No, because of the scars, his hair won't grow on it.
Oh,
I've never
okay.
seen a photo of it, but
Hmm.
that is partly, there is a scene, spoilers,
In The
that
Soprano?
his character is shot and he's in the hospital and that they've got the wig on and Tony moves it a little bit to keep that. Yeah, I just think he's a fascinating character.
Yeah.
He and I part of me is you were like, hey, Bruce, can't we do a couple of little Steven songs every show? And like I said, I there are several of his I love. I do, and he talked about the first song he wrote for a Benny King song, right? And the first song he really liked was I Don't Want to Go Home. And
Hmm.
that is one of my favorite songs. And then It's Been a Long Time is the other one that I adore, that only one coat between us, but we never got cold, and how we made a lot of money and then we spent a lot of money.
Hmm.
It just is a fascinating career. And when the band gets back together, he talks about that he would have to go, they worked around the Sopranos filming around his touring. And Maureen talks about she doesn't tour with him because it's his gig,
Hmm.
so you don't go to work with your husband, right? But he always jokes, she goes, but you always go to the cities that have good shopping. Like she will go to that city.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, Lou. It is amazing that in a rock and roll lifestyle where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women throwing themselves at you if
Hmm.
you wanted to, they seem to have a very happy, loving marriage,
Hmm.
and that's cool.
Yep.
I agree.
Yep.
And they are touring around the world. There is a great scene in Letter to You. It's a documentary that they did about Bruce's last album. And there is a point where Steven is talking to Bruce about a song and suggesting he does it a different way. And we were watching that, and I paused it and I go, what does that remind you, Linda? And she goes, that could be Silvio talking to Tony,
Mm.
that talking to them. Yeah, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. I think it is an amazing talk about a great career. And then when you see all the people talking about, like when Nelson Mandela was freed, and the people that give him credit for that, and I think he has a very good ego. I think he's
Mm.
proud, but he also he makes fun of himself that if there's a decision to make money or to do something creative, he will always pick creative, much to his chagrin sometimes. So
And
yeah,
and just to put a little bit of a post note on it. It's funny that he said at one point, like when he took The Sopranos, that he was broke, because now I'm looking him up and his net worth is 80 million. So things
yeah,
obviously went well for him after The
Yeah.
Sopranos.
yes,
That's quite a
yeah,
turnaround.
yes, it is. Yeah, that is great. But yeah, and I think he continues to tour with Bruce. He continues to do solo. And I think what's really nice too is when he talks about Outlaw Country and the underground garage, that I thought these independent bands talking about this was the only way we got airplay was on his band because he wants this music and he wants that history. So yeah, if you guys haven't read the book, listeners, it is a little bit of it is his story, and it also is a great history of music. All right.
So, Jesse, I
Yeah,
have a question to you for you,
yeah.
and this might be an unfair question, but if little Stevie wasn't in Bruce Springsteen's life, do you think Bruce Springsteen would be as successful as he is today?
That is a great question.
It's probably an unanswerable question, but
No, I do think that, yeah, I think you could certainly, I have often thought that if Bruce had not done, there is a version of Born in the USA that is a blues version that's much more like Nebraska.
Mhm.
And if he had done that on Born in the USA and hadn't added Dancing in the Dark, I think his career would have been Neil Young,
Mm,
which
Yeah.
is nothing to sneer at. Neil
right.
Right.
Young,
Interesting comparison. Yeah.
but because of that iconic. And I it is I was getting like, you wonder who was more important to the stage persona, Clarence or Little Steven. And I think
Hmm.
for a lot of times, Clarence, the big man, was who was this iconic.
Yeah.
But I think in a lot of ways, Little Steven was the right way. Like when you think about that, how much Born to Run, Darkness on the Edge of Town, supposedly, and everyone makes this case, but the first story I heard is Nebraska. Little Steven is the one that said the album is what's on your cassette tape. You need to
Mhm.
quit having us try to make it.
Mm.
That's the album. And I think the idea that I think it takes a special friend to put your ambition to the side to worry about your best friend.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
do think they have remained friends all these times. There is a scene where Johnny, Steven, and Bruce are all talking on one of Bruce's From My Home to Yours. During the
Hmm.
pandemic, he did radio shows for E Street Radio. And hearing the three of them talk is like the three of us,
Right.
this old of friends talking. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
If
think he certainly is a key component.
Yeah. I also wonder how Southside Johnny feels because he seems to be like
Yeah.
the one that was left behind.
He
Yeah,
seems to be happy with where he is,
Yeah.
at least.
yeah.
I think it's super interesting to make those comparisons. I would say, and in the same vein, when you mention ego, I feel like he knows when to have an ego and when not to have an ego. He is definitely aware
Yeah.
of things, whereas other musicians aren't. They're all about
Mhm.
themselves. And I think he knows when to be front and center and he knows.
The other thing I love is if you follow him on Twitter, he is very outspoken. He is a massive fan of American movie classics. He will often talk about when great movies are coming on, you should watch. He talks often about other musicians and classic. He loves classic rock and roll.
Hmm.
And he is very vocal about we need a strong, non-crazy Republican Party.
Yes.
This country works best when we have two strong parties fighting each other, arguing about what's the best way to make something accomplished. But he is very anti the current political climate
Yep.
of,
I got that impression.
Yeah.
yeah, he is. And he's funny.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, he's very funny. So thank you. Any final thoughts before we get out of here?
No, this was a eye opener, and
Well, good.
Agreed.
I'm glad you suggested it.
I
Yeah.
am,
As usual,
yeah.
you picked something that flew under the radar for us, but made us a better person.
Yeah,
Oh,
highly
thank you.
recommend all listeners out there definitely check this out.
Yeah,
Agreed.
yeah, I do think it is a really strong. You do not have to be a fan of The Sopranos. You don't have to be a fan of Bruce Springsteen. It is just a fascinating story about a fascinating life.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
and when they decide the books are called Salvation, Revolution, Revolution, Evolution, Revelations.
Mm.
And I thought that was clever too, the way they put the different phases of his life. So good. If someone wants to reach you, Karen, how can they?
I'm at Aliveria on the various social media sites, and my blog is alistuff.com. And you can find a list of things that I find interesting that you might find interesting. I'll be updating that.
Good. And Lou?
You, of course, can find me on YouTube at Lou's Reviews, where you can find latest episodes of JKL Media, including this one. We've also done a variety of other one-offs: Tragically Hip, Springsteen Western Stars, Dark Matter, The Book, Barbie, V for Vendetta, The Green Mile, Devs, Midnight Mass, just to name a few. There's quite a few more. Check them out. We also do our flagship show, which is the Babylon 5 podcast. We're taking a break right now until it's almost the middle of July. We'll be back in September to do the final season and the rest of the movies. As well, on my channel, you'll find my writer interviews as well as my Stephen King podcasts. And on Twitter, you can find me at Lou W. Sitzma, Sytsma.
And I am at Jesse Jackson DFW on X, aka Twitter. I continue to talk music, and this episode will also go up on Set Listing Bruce. This week, I had an interview with Martin Bodek. He was promoting a new book, and I reached out to him. And his book is about his grandfather fighting in four armies during World War II.
Wow.
Yeah, he is a Holocaust survivor. And what I'm really proud of it because at the beginning of the episode, as we started recording, Martin said, I've written a book about a Holocaust survivor. You do a Springsteen podcast. I do not know how this is going to work. And at the end of the episode, he said, I'll be damned if it didn't work. And I had more fun than I can imagine. So
Awesome.
look for that. It's an episode with Martin Bodek on Set Listing Brokers. All right. We will be back next week. We've got a couple more episodes planned before we take our summer break. But for now, everyone be safe, be kind, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And see.
The proceeding has been a JKL Media production.